Bienvenue, Sego, Tansi, Tunga Sugit. My name is Carola Weil. I'm Dean of Continuing Studies at McGill University. Today, we are gathered in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, the traditional territory of indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters from which we host today's events, in the spirit of the Longhouse, or gathering place, that used to bring people together from all over in Kanagawa. We recognize that when we stand together, we can have more positive impact. As we celebrate the beginning of McGill University's third and the McCord Museum's second century, we have an opportunity to reimagine the role that institutions of learning and culture like McGill University and the McCord Museum can and should play in the life of our diverse society. This is also an opportunity for McGillians to reinforce ties with our neighbors, with our local communities across the city, the country, and the world. So the timing was perfect for us to partner with our neighbors and create the McGill-McCord Dialogue series to mark these special anniversaries and to take continuing education and lifelong learning on a journey beyond the ivory tower of higher education. We launched a series on September 30th, the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, with a conversation led by McGill's Professor Wanda Gabriel. We have and will continue to devote several dialogues to key aspects of Indigenous life. We also have had a session presented by one of our course lecturers, Gopinath Jayabalaratnam, in collaboration with La Presse reporter Henri Ouellet-Vézina, focusing on Quebec and Montreal politics and the links to local media. And tomorrow we will be featuring a discussion that highlights the linkages between fashion and human resources. Who knew? With our own Sonia Di Maulo and Maha Daoud. So I welcome you to join us tomorrow next door. If you missed any of these sessions, as well as this afternoon's, the recordings are available on the SES YouTube channel, and we invite you to tune in at any point in time. These dialogues are here for you, our community of friends, neighbors, students, alumni, and colleagues, to actively engage with the ideas, images, and artifacts that McGill and McCord offer, to help shape our own knowledge and the future before us. I want to thank my colleagues both at McGill School of Continuing Studies and at the McCord Museum for their very hard work and creativity in standing up this partnership and series. A special word of appreciation goes to Paula Bernardino, chair of the School of Continuing Studies Bicentennial Committee, and Maria Luisa Romano of the McCord Museum. But today, we are very fortunate to hear from one of our own SES faculty lecturers, Kevin Stanley. Kevin Stanley has been teaching English to newcomers and international students for over 30 years. He joined the School of Continuing Studies team in Languages and Intercultural Communication as a faculty lecturer and program coordinator in 2012. Passionate about history and culture, in 2018 he developed a course that's focused on the story of Canada, which helps students sharpen their English language skills by exploring stories from Canadian history from the perspective of newcomers. Not everyone can join his classes in person, so we invite you this afternoon to get a little taste of what he has to offer in his class. In his presentation today, Kevin will take us back in time to the Great Peace, when the French signed the peace treaty in 1701 in Montreal with the five-nation Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, ending almost a century of hostilities marked by atrocities on both sides. This was a watershed historical moment, not just for the history of Canada, but for the city of Montreal, and the communities on the island. Kevin Stanley's presentation promises to bring to life this important historical event and show how popular movements, including those featured in the McCord exhibition All Together on McGill College Avenue, can foster lifelong learning. So I invite you on this journey back in time with my very esteemed colleague, Kevin Stanley. And if I may just ask you, when you have a question for Professor Stanley, if you would please use a microphone, it'll be coming around, but otherwise you won't be heard on our recording. So with that, I turn this over to Kevin. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you.
Thank you, Carola, for that introduction. And yes, it's the question of like why I would want to choose a topic like this to talk about, or why I chose this particular aspect of history. And I was trying to link to that exhibit over on McGill College. If you've seen it, there's a lovely set of photos that are there, and it's going to finish on the 17th. So you have one last chance to go over to McGill College and see all the photos. I was inspired by that because it's about gatherings. It's about people coming together in Montreal to do whatever they do. Sometimes they're celebrating, they're having a party, they're doing different things. But I was thinking, what in history matches that? And I thought, well, this is the mother of all gatherings. This is this incredible peace conference that happened in 1701, 320 years ago, right in Montreal, that transformed the history of the continent. And it's not well understood, or it's kind of overlooked in history. And one of those reasons is that a lot of the history people know about Canada, about Montreal, might have been written from different perspectives, either from French historians' perspective or from English historians' perspective. And they're quite different. And this one is one that if you look into the way that all the different players looked at it, it comes out with very different from these different points of view. So it's a story of rapprochement and diplomacy and all these different players doing the best they can, maneuvering the best they can in this geopolitical chess game of trying to get the best for their set of interests at the time. All right, so if we look at just sort of a bit of understanding what Montreal looked like at the time. This is an approximation. This is a map that was created by someone much later, but it was based on the maps and documents of the period. And you can see that there's like sort of a wall around it. This wall is actually, at the time in 1701, was a palisade, which is just a bunch of stakes made out of cedar posts all around. It wasn't a very strong wall, but it was something. And you can see there's a little fort down here. This is actually earthworks and a fort right at Pointe-à-Caillère. That's the place down in Old Montreal where, there's a museum there today, but down in that part, that's where that was. And this is a little river here. It's approximately where around the Lachine Canal came out of this river, this Rivière Saint-Pierre it was called. And that was what it was formed around. So all of this event, this little town had a population of about 1,200 residents. Okay, 1,200 people lived inside those walls, and they were, after a century of this kind of conflict, living a little bit in fear of attacks. Just 10 years before, there had been the community of Lachine, out at the end of the Lachine Canal, was attacked by Iroquois Confederacy raiders and burned to the ground and destroyed. And 80 residents were lost. Like 80 people is a lot to lose in a small community. It was quite a dramatic event. And there was a lot of interest in trying to end all this conflict. So what was all the conflict about? What was going on that made it so difficult to come up with peace? Well, this map is sort of showing this area of North America at this time. So I've represented the green areas up here are the sort of settled areas of it's a little bit out of whack now. The settled areas of the French colonists, it got moved, I guess. They were a little bit out of alignment. But basically, up and down the St. Lawrence River, there was some settlement of the French. I have to gesture through here. Over here at Port Royal in Acadia, there was some settlements of the French. And then this red stuff represents where the English were. The British colonies of New England and New York and all the way down. And those are the settled areas. This purple area is the area of the Haudenosaunee, all right? This is the territory of the Iroquois Confederacy, of the Five Nations. The Five Nations, the Seneca, the Cayuga, the Onondaga, the Oneida, and the Mohawks, all the way through this area of what is today New York State and southern Quebec in this area. Now, they were a powerful military force in this area, and they were generally allied to the English. Albany was really the center of the English fur trade and English economy at the time. New York wasn't that well developed at this time, but Albany was where the governor was. And the Haudenosaunee were always in communication with them. The Five Nations really depended on trade with the English and got their weapons from them and continued in that kind of thing. And they were opposed to the French in general. They would ally to the English, and the French and the English, they've been fighting each other for like 1,000 years, right? At this point, they've always had some kind of war going on in Europe, so every time that broke out, there would be, it would spill over into the colonies that they'd be fighting. But the French were not alone in their fight against the Haudenosaunee. They had a bunch of other allies. All through this part of the Great Lakes region, the French had very carefully built up a network of allies. And this, in fact, was the entire colonial strategy of the French. The English strategy was to bring colonists and bring people and settlers and build farms and encourage them to have families and expand their settlements. The French really weren't looking at it that way. This was more of a commercial enterprise of trying to build up the fur trade. And their entire strategy was on making alliances with different indigenous communities and different nations. Now, they weren't all monolithic and uniform. They had their own agendas. Of course they did. They knew what they wanted. They wanted to trade, or they might have another enemy. There was a lot of other conflicts and shifting alliances. Each community, each group had its own very clear interests, and that's why the French their entire strategy was on building and maintaining the peace among their own allies. But the big piece in the puzzle was the Five Nations, the Haudenosaunee. They were sworn enemies of many of these other groups, and they would be fighting. There was a lot of conflict. And it went on for, as Carola said, a century. From around 1600, at the beginning of the fur trade, these constant battles, and there was these devastating wars. And these had been taking quite a toll on all the communities, the Haudenosaunee communities and all the French ally communities. In general, there were the Iroquois language groups and the Algonquin language groups, of these two cultural divisions. That's sort of how they worked out. But they'd be fighting each other regularly. And the French would side with them and help them with raids. The English would side with this. It was quite a complex thing. But what was changing at the end, there was a couple of key things that happened at the end of the 17th century. One was Frontenac, all right? The governor Frontenac, he was on his second stint. He did 20 years as governor of New France, Frontenac. In his second term, which was the last decade of his life, up till 1698, he really was trying to bring about peace. He saw that this wasn't sustainable, all right? You could not continue all this violence, all this war, and they needed to do something to put an end to it. But there's all these different players, and there's nobody, there might be, a group from one of these centers that would say, well, no, I don't want peace now, right? And then 10 years or 5 years later, it's a very different story. It was a lot of shifting alliances and ideas. And even the famous Five Nations, they were not unified. The Seneca, who were out on the western edge of it, they bore the brunt of a lot of the attacks from the others, and they were really sick of all this. The Mohawks, who were a lot more protected over by Albany, they were like, yeah, let's keep fighting, you know. So they had to really come together to agree to put an end to all the fighting, and it took a long time. It took a lot of diplomacy and a lot of different people working on it. So there's really four main centers. There's Albany, there's Montreal, the center of the fur trade. There's Michilimackinac, which is, I'm not sure if I said that right. It's over here. It's right up around the northern Michigan, okay, up in that area there. There's a place there called Mackinac now. It's a community. It's that sort of three-way crossing point of the three Great Lakes, all right? It was an important area, and was really where the main Odawa groups were, and the Wendat. So that was an important center. Then there was a place that's sort of collectively called Onondaga. It was sort of the capital of the Five Nations, right in the center, where a lot of the meetings would happen. So these sort of four different capitals, if you will, are where all these different groups are represented and are negotiating with each other, trying to vie for supremacy. Now, what was working for the success of the Great Peace was Frontenac spending 10 years working on it, and then his successor, Carrière, who was Louis Hector de Carrière, he took it over at the end and sort of scored the final goal to finish it in the last 3 years when he took over as governor. He had been governor of Montreal for 10 years before that, so he knew the story, but he took over and finished this great project of Frontenac's. Why it didn't work for the English were doing their best to undermine the whole thing. They knew that if the French could put an end to the war, then that would be it for the English. They would, they might, you know, they were depending on having the Five Nations harass the French all the time. That was their whole strategy of keeping the French contained. So they were trying to undermine it. They were trying to, you know, get them to stop. But what was working in the favor of the French is the English had a, oh, come on in, they changed their governors really frequently. They had a new governor every year or two, and there was a lot of inexperienced people coming in, and they didn't quite understand the situation. So not having those experienced hands in charge really made a difference. So that's sort of the setting, and in those 10 years leading up to 1701, the French continued all this diplomacy. It all kind of culminated in the summer of 1700, when Carrière had become the governor, and he sent some emissaries down to Onondaga to finally work out some of the details with the Haudenosaunee assembly there, the different people coming together from the different nations. And they were very successful. Who he sent was, there was a Jesuit priest who spoke the language. There was another Frenchman who had been captured in the wars and spent many years and had been adopted by the Oneida. So he sent the right people who knew how to communicate and how to put all this together. And they spent the summer negotiating. There's a nice story of this, you know, when the governor in Albany got wind of this, he sent someone to go and try to, you know, upset the apple cart and stop it. But this young guy, this young military officer, arrives in Onondaga and commanded all the Five Nations leaders to come to Albany for consultations. And they were so insulted by this oversight of protocol of, like, you don't get to command us what we do. We're your allies. We're not your subjects. So they were so upset at the English that they ignored him and said, oh, we'll talk to you later. And it sort of tipped the balance towards the French at that time. So after the success of that, they signed an agreement, sort of temporary agreement in 1700, and said, come back in 1701, next summer, I like this line, at strawberry time, that's the time to come, to come in the, you know, the period of the high summer, and they came to come to Montreal. And immediately Callière, for the fall, dispatched a bunch of emissaries, these different priests and Jesuits who spoke the languages, to go out to go visit all the allies and get them to come too. This was going to be a comprehensive peace. Everybody, all the nations were going to sign. And it's like founding the United Nations. It was like a way of putting an end to 100 years of war and conflict in the region. So what really prompted everyone to go with this wasn't just about peace and love. There was real practical reasons why the different communities wanted to put an end to this too. For the French, they knew they could never really expand and build security and grow their colonies if they couldn't get peace. It was just too risky. In France, the reputation was you're constantly being attacked, or it's dangerous, or these kind of stories, so many people didn't want to go. For the Five Nations, this century of warfare had a big cost. There was a lot of deaths, right? A lot of people died. All the nations were weaker over that century because of European diseases. Smallpox wiped out more people than any of the wars. But all these nations were weaker and got progressively weaker and lost their capacity to rebuild. If you lose a young warrior who's 25 years old, it's a big deal for a community. That's a, you know, these guys are working to contribute not just with war and violence, but they lost them. They also lost them to be taken prisoner. A lot of people were captured in these wars, and they'd go and be adopted and go live in these other communities, kind of like forced labor, slaves maybe, in some cases you might call it that, but in many cases they get very integrated into the communities they were taken into. So generations of people have been lost, and they weren't being replaced. In fact, some of the prisoner taking was to replace losses. You know, sometimes an elder would say, well, we need to get like 5 new young men after this battle, so capture some young men to be workers in the community. It was that kind of thing. And this is one of these big sticking points in the negotiations, was getting the prisoners back, getting people to go back to where they came from. It's interesting, there was a number of French prisoners, women especially, who were held by the Mohawks, who didn't want to go back. They didn't want to go back to Montreal or Quebec or somewhere like that. They were perfectly happy with their life in the village. That was a better option. Anyway, this great triumph of Callière's of getting everyone to agree, it was going to happen in the summer of 1701. I'm going to send this out to look at, just so you can start looking at the documents. You can have a look and pass it back there. People can pass it around. When you're done, just maybe pass it on to someone else back there. So this event, this great thing, Callière knew what he was doing, and this is one thing you can give credit to the French for, is they knew their business. They knew about how to conduct such an event with all these participants who were Indigenous. They studied it well, where that arrogance coming from the English colonists of just trying to command people didn't really work, that people like Frontenac or Callière knew very well what the protocols were, knew what the rules were of this kind of conduct. So I'm moving on with my people here. There's Callière with the great hair, the great wig. And the other fellow there is a guy named Kondiaronk. I don't know how to pronounce his name. I'm not sure. That's how it's spelt, Kondiaronk. If you've ever been up on top of Mount Royal, you'll see there's the Belvedere there. It's called the Belvedere Kondiaronk. It's named after him, after the Great Peace. He was from Michilimackinac, up there in that area, and he was a very important leader. But why he's really famous for this event is that he became the chief advocate of it among the French allies. He traveled around and spoke on behalf of the French and convinced all the others, or most of the others, to join. He used his prestige and power to really make this happen, his diplomatic skills. Now, he wasn't necessarily a born pacifist. 10 years earlier, he was leading those raids against the the Haudenosaunee and burning down villages and doing all that. But he was a shrewd player. He knew exactly what was going to work for his people at that time. When it was time to stop all this to everyone's advantage, he did it. So the two of them are sort of held up as the two who made all this happen, Kondiaronk and Calliere. So, I'll get to that one in a moment. All right. So they start arriving. It's summer. It's July. This whole event took 20 days, this gathering, 20 days in July and August. Around the middle of July, 200 delegates from the Five Nations arrived at Sault Ste. Louis. Sault Ste. Louis today is known as Ganawage, across the river, all right? It was called Sault Ste. Louis because that was the name of the rapids that are there. And that was the community that was there. It was a group of Five Nations people who had been Christianized or had been converted and were living there. And that's where these 200 delegates arrived. The next day, 200 canoes with 800 delegates from the Great Lakes nations arrived. They came down, they've been coming up the river, arrived at Montreal, and were greeted by the diplomats and the French and the governor, and everyone came out and greeted them with all the right protocols. So you've got, in total, 1,300 delegates coming, not just from the Great Lakes and the Five Nations, but also from as far away as what is today New Brunswick. They were coming from everywhere. They came from the Abenaki people, from the Mi'kmaq people, from all the Algonquin nations in the north of Quebec. Calliere and Frontenac first, but Calliere finished it and wanted to say, we're going to get everybody in on this piece. We're going to get every nation so that we can establish security for everyone. And Kondiaronk was the key person there. So they all arrived, all these canoes. There was cannon salutes off the walls of Montreal. The French marched out with their soldiers and did gun salutes and greeted all the chiefs coming and all the different dignitaries from all the nations. They had prepared well too. Calliere had ordered lots of firewood to be prepared for everyone, a lot of building materials, branches, because what would happen is the Indigenous delegates would arrive and they'd build a shelter, and they needed all these supplies for that, like tree branches and everything. So they built, all this was prepared in advance to host people on this scale. Lots of supplies were brought in, food. All the merchants in Montreal prepared for all the trade that was coming because people brought trade goods. So they stocked up on everything. Calliere banned alcohol for the entire month. He said no alcohol for anybody. Like it was like just made it a dry town because they knew, and this was actually at the request of some of the delegates in advance, said we shouldn't have alcohol because it's going to lead to all kinds of trouble, so let's just make everybody no drinking. And so that was all done, it was all planned, and a lot of gifts. All these peace conferences required a lot of gifts for everyone, and Calliere spent a lot of his own money preparing it and getting it all ready, and they put it all together. They all arrived. It went on for 20 days, and these types of peace conferences were all about speeches. The culture required a lot of oratory, okay? So quite often, the person who'd be speaking would be selected by his community, or her, well, mostly his community, I guess, in this case, and wasn't necessarily the most important person in the community. It was just the person who was the best speaker, the person who could really, hold forth and have the nice flowery speech. And it's so interesting when you read the French in the document, if you can read it, it's got the same kind of language. There's all these translations, this kind of flowery speech and all this stuff. That's the way it was written, the way people actually said it. There were translations. Many of those things were said by the speakers, the delegates in the document there, about what they thought and all the it's all, there's a particular type of language that's used, and the better you were at that, the better you were at diplomacy, that kind of thing. So all that went on, but kind of a tragedy struck in all this. There was an epidemic. All right, a lot of the French called it a bad cold. That's the way it was written about. It was a bad cold went through, and a lot, but it was a pretty serious cold because it killed maybe 100 people, all right, who died of this virus, this infection, whatever it was, including, sadly, Kondiaronk. He died the day before, or 2 days before the final ceremony. He spoke on the day he died. He was one of the speakers and was imploring everyone. But his death might have been the catalyst that finally pushed it over the top, in fact, that the respect that he had garnered among all these communities made everyone want to sign. So he died. Now, Callière didn't skip a beat in a way. They put on a big elaborate funeral. That's what Notre Dame Basilica looked like at the time. He put on a full, and the French know how to do this, right? The French know how to put on a show, right? With the procession of soldiers and priests and this big thing. He was buried at Notre Dame, the old Notre Dame church, which was just in front of where the current Notre Dame Basilica is. That's where that church was. And this big parade up and down through the streets and a full-on celebration of Kondiaronk's life. But it sort of cast a pall over the whole thing. So just incidentally about Kondiaronk, he was kind of idealized by French writers later. They made him into this noble savage thing, right? They sort of really expanded on it, and he wound up showing up in all kinds of plays and poetry in France in the later century, but the whole story had got distorted into something it really wasn't. He was a shrewd diplomat who was doing the best he could to meet the interests of his people. But, he was not some kind of noble savage or whatever that means. That's that whole thing. But that was part of that whole thing. But he later, the French writers turned him into something he wasn't. But he certainly was an accomplished diplomat. So finally, August 4th, they built outside, back in the, let me go back to to this image, out around here, outside the city, they built this big walled area that would seat 2,000 people, all right? So they had room for all the delegates. It was 43 meters by 24 meters. It was like this arena they built. It was all covered with branches. They built a little raised platform for the governor. This image here is from someone at the Pointe-à-Callière Museum. There's the governor sitting up there up on this dais, and you can see a scribe writing. But you have to imagine this scene. You've got everybody in their finery. You've got all the French and their powdered wigs and the gowns and the whole outfit and all the soldiers and all that. And then you've got all the regalia of all the different Indigenous delegates, this big, colorful thing. And they're all rubbing shoulders. There's a lot of people. It's just a big party that they're having, this kind of thing, with a lot of food and music and speeches and speeches and speeches all day, everyone talking. Translators everywhere, these Jesuits who were working double time trying to translate, but it was the way it's described in the different kind of letters are written by people as this strange mix of culture, of this kind of bizarre scene that some of the French writers were kind of ridiculing it, but you're not hearing that from the real players. The Jesuits, the diplomats, the Callière, they're not saying, oh, it was silly that we're out there, it's all ridiculous being with all the, it's all these other observers who found it kind of strange. But the reality was this was a diplomatic gathering. This was a huge peace conference, and it worked. The document you see, that you can see this kind of thing, the last pages, these marks. These were not made by the participants. This is something that was drawn by a scribe. It's all in the same hand. The person who wrote out all the document drew all these pictures. This was not like, these are not the real signatures of the people who participated in it. What they were drawn, and then you know, perhaps they were shown to the participants and said, is this okay to represent you or whatever? But it's not like these are the drawings of the actual people there. And in fact, when the letter is sent accompanying this, when this was sent to France, back to Versailles, you know, this is when Louis XIV was the king, they said, you know, Caillère actually said, look, this is a copy of this isn't the real document anyway, like it's a copy of it. But it is an interesting sort of piece of that kind of diversity. What's incredible about this is there are 40 sovereign nations signing this. France and 39 indigenous nations signed this document and agreed to this. The indigenous nations that signed it wouldn't have said, oh, I signed something. They agreed to it. They orally spoke about it. They said, this is what I agreed to, and it was all read back to them. But they didn't really value the piece of paper the way the Europeans did. They didn't think it meant anything, particularly having it on a paper. It was more of, but there's 40 signatures on here, 40 different nations agreeing to this. And that's an incredible accomplishment that happened, this gathering, that these 20 days led to this agreement. And it worked. There were still some skirmishes, but the major conflicts were over until 1754, which was when the 7 Years' War began between the English and the French that led to the conquest of the British taking over North America. So it was 53 years of peace to allow New France to flourish and to grow and stop the conflict that had gone on for so long. So that's, it's time for me to open it up to questions. And yeah, why don't we, there's a microphone circulating if anyone wants to ask something. No questions, okay. All right, well, are there no questions at all? Okay. Yes. Hey, Derek, yes. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Kevin, what was the composition of Montreal at that time?
The population at the time was about...
And then who was living there?
Well, in the city, there were about 1,200 fur traders and merchants and families. But on the island of Montreal, there was Lachine, which is a smaller community, but not very far down the road here, over at around Sherbrooke and Atwater, there was a village called, in the French documents, is le village de la Montagne. And that meant a community of Iroquois that were living here. There was about 400 or 500 living there as well. So Montreal was a pretty small place, not too big, but there was more delegates coming that summer than there was a population. You know, there was 1,300 delegates and 1,200 residents of Montreal.
So when you describe the people describing the event, are those the residents sort of reflecting on this strange, like it was like an...
Exactly. You've got
Yeah.
different diplomats and different officials of different kinds. But it's also, the other thing historians have to do is they look at it, that everyone's got an agenda. You know, there was a lot of people who criticized Caillère, right? There was people who were vying for his job later, right? And they'd write a snarky letter to someone back in Paris saying, well, he went and did this, right? I can't believe he agreed to that, that kind of thing. So there was a lot of politics. Of course there's politics. Like, and, you know, among, why it took many years for the Five Nations to come together too is that there'd be different agendas and people would be trying to undermine it and someone who had something else to happen. So there would be people writing about it with different, you know, different agendas and different points of view. Why it's this is kind of this extraordinary event's kind of downplayed in a lot of Canadian history is because the English, they were dismissive of the whole thing, right? It didn't hardly exist. It's the French writers had a different take on it. So it's like this completely different point of view. You know, the English, it was a failure. It was a massive diplomatic failure for the English, right? They lost their alliance with the Five Nations. But, you know, the Five Nations were saying, look, you're not a reliable supplier of weapons for us as like you used to be. You're not coming to our protection when we're getting attacked out in the West. from these nations. So why should we trust you, right? And that idea of subjugation. There were a lot of writers who looked at it like the Haudenosaunee wanted to, it was strictly an economic arrangement to try to, maximize their fur trade profits. But there's a writer I'm thinking of said, they had a lot of reasons, to make peace, but one of the main outcomes of this was maintaining independence. They were being encroached upon by the English. The English colonies were growing and growing, and this pressure was constant of more territory and trying to expand. But this allowed another 50 years of the Confederacy to remain politically neutral and independent, and resist these encroachments. The French were not really a threat for territory. They just wanted this kind of arrangement where they could freely pass and do trade. They weren't planning to settle all this area. They just wanted to have peace. But the English were pushing territorially. So there was a lot of motivation for changing that.
So how important do you think this event was for the formation of Montreal?
Well, Montreal was established, but it allowed Montreal to grow as a fur trade center. I mean, the real reason Montreal is here is the fur trade. There's a reason there's a beaver on our coat of arms, right? Is that this is a place where all the trade could happen, and you could transfer furs and goods from shipping that could go directly to Europe. Sailing ships could come up to here. They couldn't pass the Lachine Rapids, but the reason we grew as a city was all about the fur trade. That's why we're here. So Montreal needed to have security to grow, and so this was a safe hub for trade. And it transformed where Quebec was the political capital of the colony of New France. Montreal became the commercial capital, and grew and became the commercial capital of Canada up until the 1980s. So yeah.
I was going to ask about the British response, but you mentioned that they basically dismissed it. They didn't pay much attention to it. But did this event affect alliances in future conflicts?
Well, yes. So when the 7 Years' War came, they were back to this. And in fact, the American scholars call the 7 Years' War the French and Indian War. The British call it the 7 Years' War, but it's the French and Indian War because it was more about that kind of. I mean, the Haudenosaunee didn't ally with the French. They just made peace with the French, and they agreed to stay out of the conflict with that. Although they were pulled into it in the 7 Years' War, they were involved in it. It wasn't, there was still a lot of these kind of shifts in alliances. I mean, it was also a rocky road too, all the way through, because the political structure of the Five Nations and all of the nations was not so authoritarian. They were consensus building. They were about different people different interests would be represented in the community. And sometimes basically some young hothead would go out and lead a raiding party against a village just because they wanted to make a name for themselves, right? So some young guy would go out and start murdering their neighbors and across the way, and all these agreements were off again, like it would keep the whole thing going. So there was, you couldn't have that kind of authority, but what happened again? The cooler heads, the elders said, "Look, we need to survive and keep our, we're weakened. We're much weaker than we were 100 years ago. It's time for us to find a way forward to keep going." And they did, and it worked for at least a time. I mean, in the end, the English expanded right through and pushed them out, but it bought them some time and some peace from the French.
Kevin, I was just wondering, do we know the Indigenous perspective on this event? Like we mentioned, the English and the French. Is there?
No, I couldn't say that we do. I don't. I mean, the sources we have. A lot of the, when you read the documents, there's transcriptions of speeches, that people said at the time. But if you're talking about like today's perspective on it, I don't know. I can't speak to that. I don't know. I just think it was an like I found it so interesting how the different players were trying to look out for their own interests, right? That they're trying to find a way forward in a situation where like they're trying to foresee the future. They're trying to see what's going to happen. They're trying to do best for their people. And all the way through, that's the message that I got reading everything. It's like, yeah, this guy is deciding to do this now. It didn't make sense to him 5 years earlier because of that, but now, the situation as it is, as it shifts, makes the most sense to pursue peace now and pursue your interests. But today, it's very hard to say what, I don't know. I don't have a perspective on that. But, nothing is that simple, right? There's a lot of opinions and views of it. Like even Ganawage, as I said, Ganawage wasn't a traditional community. It was one that was established around 350 years ago by as a mission post where Christian people who converted to Christianity went there because they left their own communities. They were like they weren't welcome or something like that, so they built their own little community there. And so that's how it established. But like things aren't always from time immemorial, right? There's other perspectives there, and the agendas of the people living in Ganawage or the Village de la Montagne are different too. They're like, well, we're Christians and we want to be here because it's closer to the priests or to the churches or something. So that was their agenda, what their reason for doing it. They signed too, right? They had their own perspective of this. They were part of the story, right? So their interests are different from the ones of the Senecas or the Oneidas or anyone else. It's always complicated. There's no monolithic blocks here. Everybody's got their own point and their own thing they're trying to accomplish. But this gathering, that's in the end, that's what it is. This gathering, this extraordinary event, is led to this peace.
Do you think that this treaty was empowered the alliance between the French, the English, and the nations, like in the case of the 1812 war?
If you build some peace for some time, you build some trust, those types of things. When the War of 1812 came, I think some of these, the French had worked really hard at these alliances, and the better governors of the British governors of the province of Canada after that recognized those relationships and realized how valuable they were, right? That these were very well established, and not to just be an expansionist who's just going to push them out. Now, I'm not saying that was the case in all cases. There's lots of terrible examples of abuse, but I think those allies, those auxiliary soldiers or whoever who would help out with when the Americans came across the border and attacked, it might have been they had an attachment to these older alliances. If you look at something like the Abenakis, that nation is so long established as an ally of the French for centuries. They said, oh, we'll settle in. These people are here. We'll deal with it. We'll settle and live and have security instead of conflict. And that was a decision those communities made at their time. Yes, it's colonization, and it's devastating in many ways. I'm not really talking about that, but they are making their choice in some ways, right? The French were less about force; they were more about alliances than the English were. That's just in general, because they couldn't. I mean, one of the reasons the French did this in the first place, why their whole strategy had to be like this, is they were outnumbered 10-1 by the English. The English colonies were growing leaps and bounds, and the French were not. At one point, Caillard writes a letter, says, even though the English are twice as numerous as us, so he was exaggerating that by a power of 5. They were 10 times more population in the American colonies compared to the French. They could never stand up to them. So they needed the Allies for protection. And see a map of New France, and they're claiming all this territory all over, North America, it's like, no, they have an influence there, but they don't control it. They certainly don't control it. They've got alliances. That's what it was. I think you had a question?
Yes. Did the agreement deal with issues of territory, sovereignty over territory? Who owns what territory?
Well, not exactly, and they stayed away from the most contentious stuff. What the agreement was about was there was some details about some territories, but sovereignty over territories of it is not. It's a different concept. You know, the way that the Europeans would think about it, it's like, well, this is my land and that's your land, and I have absolute control. I mean, these are people coming from absolute monarchies, right? From Louis XIV and whatever. But for, you know, there was overlapping hunting territories from different communities, and that was always something that all these communities could live with. They didn't really have a problem with that. But there was agreements, usually made orally, about when and how to share those resources that would be made. The actual document doesn't get into those kind of specifics. It sort of creates a framework for that. And it was about, the biggest issue was about prisoner exchanges and getting people back. That was the thing that took the longest to resolve. There were, you know, there might be a family in a community, in a village, that says, well, no, you can't have him back. He's been living with us for 15 years, and we need him. And so they just say, no, like, he can't go. And so there was no central authority, say, in Onondaga saying, well, yes, I will return all prisoners, because they had to get the agreement of every family that had one living with them. Like, it's pretty hard to do. And it was the same with the Great Lakes nations. Giving up prisoners was a really big problem, and it took a long time to resolve. And in the end, they had to say, well, no, you can't have them all, you can have most of them, or whatever. It was a kind of thing. But yeah, they didn't get into the territory so much. Because the way it was understood is, this is their traditional territory. No one was really disputing that. And the way that the Five Nations or these other ones would view it is they might go and attack and destroy, but they weren't trying to conquer it. It wasn't conquest. It was more about destroying them so they weren't a threat. You know, it was.
There was no feeling that the French colonization was sort of encroaching?
Not the way that they viewed the English one. Because the French hadn't come much further than Montreal, really. But because the strategy was very different. It was about trade. They weren't trying to settle people in what is Ontario today. There were forts, Fort Frontenac, which is Kingston, at Niagara and at Detroit. These were forts that were built, but they were about fur trading. They were about protecting the fur trade industry, not about colonization or setting up they were colonization in that way, that they were setting out a military presence, but they weren't about settlers and farms and that kind of thing. That was really confined to the St. Lawrence Valley at that time. These are great questions. Any other questions? How's our time? We're getting to the end. I have another slide with if you are interested in reading more, this is a really great book. It's called The Great Peace of Montreal. It's by a writer from France named Gilles Havard. This translation is published by McGill Queen's University Press in 2001. Excellent book. It really there's a few other books, but this one is a nice comprehensive study of a lot of these different perspectives of different points of view. So I'd recommend that if you want to know more about this. But other than that, that's it. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.